Welcome to day 179 of 66 and 26. This is Thursday, and on Thursdays in our journey to read through the Bible, we're in the Old Testament prophets. So today we're back in Ezekiel chapters 32 to 34. One of the things that you have no doubt noticed with the prophets is that they're often expressing God's judgment upon the nations and upon the people of Israel. And sometimes this can sound very harsh because we expect God to be compassionate and forgiving and loving, and yet we hear in the prophets and throughout the Old Testament, we hear the judgment of the Lord, and that can be really hard. But Ezekiel addresses this. Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 17, God speaks through Ezekiel and says, "Your countrymen say, the way of the Lord is not just, but it is their way that is not just." God is acknowledging that it's the sin of the people that brings about justice and judgment, not because God delights. In fact, just before this, Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, God says, "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live." Turn from your evil ways. God, very often, when he's speaking words of judgment, when he brings acts of judgment upon the people of the nations or upon Israel, his intent is not actually to destroy. That's not his desire that he would destroy people. He actually wants to bring them back to him, to turn them in repentance. And so very often God's judgment is just a flash judgment. It's not the full judgment that would come upon people at the end of time when he will return and bring about the final judgment. But all these judgments along the way, all these acts of wrath and vengeance from the Lord are actually almost like discipline. If you would swat the behind, if you would spank a child in order not to punish but to get their attention. These acts of judgment from God are intended to turn people back, get their attention, and say, you've turned away from your Creator. You have lived with injustice and broken all the promises and commandments from God, and so turn back from your evil ways. That's God's intent. In these chapters also, we see God addressing very specifically the rulers of Israel, not just the other nations, but the rulers of Israel. So when we get to Ezekiel chapter 34, he says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel." Now, often we think of shepherds in our time as if God is speaking to the pastors, like the spiritual leaders of the church. But in the ancient world, and especially at this time in the Old Testament, shepherds were describing symbolically the kings of the nations, or the kings of Israel specifically in this case, or the kings of Judah. And this is very similar to what we saw earlier this week on Tuesday when we were in 1 Kings 22, and Ahab goes to war against the king of Aram, and then the prophet Micaiah tells Ahab, "I saw all Israel scattered as sheep without a shepherd." And that sheep without a shepherd was a way of the prophet saying the king is going to be no more. The king is going to be killed in battle. And Ahab knew exactly what he meant. He said, "See, I said he never prophesies anything good about me." Well, that concept of the shepherd is about the kings, not the priests, not the pastors, but the kings of Israel. And the kings of Israel and Judah have been wicked. They've not been taking care of the sheep, the people of the nation. And so God says, "I will shepherd my people. I will be their king," in other words, "and I will place on the throne David." In Ezekiel 34, verse 23, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. Now, this is not literally David. David had already died, and at this point in Israel's history, David was long gone. But there will be a descendant of David, Jesus, who will be the true king, the one shepherd, who will rule over all the flock of Israel. And that's God's intent in bringing a word of accusation and judgment upon the kings of Israel. Say, I have a much better solution, not men to rule, but God himself, the Son of David, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who will be king, the one shepherd over all.